The rich man, hearing a strange rustling, turned and saw the unbelievable scene. The albino lion, a white spectre under the setting sun, rescuing the elderly woman. Fear, a primitive terror, froze his spine. He tried to flee, but the image of the protective beast and sudden guilt made him trip over his own feet, falling awkwardly. It was at that exact moment that police sirens echoed in the distance, sealing the coward's fate. Justice, guided by a beast and by chance, had arrived. The impact was brutal, the cold, damp earth against the rich man's face, the smell of wet soil and humiliation mixing with the terror that invaded him. He tried to get up, his muscles paralyzed by shock and panic. The image of the albino lion, majestic and enigmatic, still lingered in his mind, a vision that defied all logic and his entire understanding of the world. How could a wild beast have acted with such compassion? The sound of the sirens, previously distant, now tore through the night air, approaching with relentless urgency. Each luminous pulse of the blue and red lights dancing among the trees seemed like a hammer striking his guilty conscience. He was trapped, not just by his clumsy fall, but by the web of his own cruel actions. Fate, or perhaps a greater force, had woven an intricate plan, using a wild creature as its instrument of justice. The albino lion, an almost ethereal figure under the setting sun that now gave way to twilight, remained a few feet away, its golden eyes fixed on the fallen man, a silent and imposing sentinel. Beside the beast, the elderly woman, still in her wheelchair, looked fragile but unharmed, her gaze fixed on the lion, a mixture of awe and gratitude that transcended words. She had been rescued from a terrible fate, and her savior was the most unlikely of heroes. The lights of the police vehicles finally burst into the clearing, illuminating the macabre scene. 2 patrol cars stopped abruptly, and the officers, armed and on high alert, jumped out. Their eyes, trained for chaos and criminality, widened at the sight. The rich man, fallen and visibly shaken, the elderly woman in her wheelchair beside a freshly dug grave, and at the center of it all, an albino lion of an almost supernatural whiteness, observing them with disturbing calm. "Hands up! Don't move!" shouted Sergeant Almeida, his voice firm but with a poorly disguised tone of disbelief. He pointed his weapon at the rich man, but his eyes, and those of his team, were divided between the aggressor and the imposing beast. Never in their careers had they encountered anything like this. A wild lion at a crime scene, acting as a protector. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of imminent danger and the surreal nature of the situation. The rich man, paralyzed by fear and shame, offered no resistance. He was handcuffed and lifted from the ground, his eyes fixed on the lion, which did not move. The beast, in turn, seemed to ignore the police, keeping its focus on the elderly woman, as if its mission was not yet complete. The officers approached with extreme caution, their weapons lowered but ready for any unexpected movement from the animal. The priority was the victim's safety and the aggressor's containment, but the lion presented an unprecedented dilemma. "Ma'am, are you all right?" asked a female officer, her voice soft, trying not to startle either the elderly woman or the lion. The elderly woman merely nodded, her eyes teary, pointing at the lion with a trembling finger. He saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion and cold. Sergeant Almeida, a veteran with years of experience, felt a shiver down his spine. He had seen everything, but an albino lion acting as a guardian angel was something that defied all logical explanation. As the rich man was led to the patrol car, muttering incoherently about monsters and nightmares, the albino lion finally shifted its gaze from the elderly woman. With one last deep look at the scene, as if assessing that justice was being served, the beast slowly turned and with silent, majestic steps disappeared into the darkness of the forest. leaving behind a trail of mystery and a story no one would ever believe. Only the distant sound of sirens and the stunned silence of the officers bore witness to the miracle that had just occurred. The silence that followed the albino lion's departure was denser than the forest's own darkness. It was not a common silence, but a vacuum of sound filled with disbelief and the ghostly echo of a miracle. The headlights of the patrol cars, previously intrusive, now seemed like mere spotlights on a stage where the most extraordinary play of everyone's lives had just been performed. The officers, previously on high alert, were now petrified, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed on the spot where the beast had vanished, as if expecting the supernatural whiteness to reappear at any moment. Sergeant Almeida, a man who had faced humanity's darkest side for decades, felt a tremor run down his spine. It wasn't fear of the lion, which had proven itself a guardian, but the terror of incomprehension. How would he report this? How would he explain to his superiors that a wild lion, an alpha predator, had acted with the compassion of a saint, rescuing an elderly woman from a grave and delivering her aggressor to justice? The scene defied logic, science, and everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The female officer who had spoken with the elderly woman, a young rookie named Silva, knelt beside the wheelchair, her voice still choked with emotion. "Ma'am, are you sure you're all right? We need to take you to a hospital." The elderly woman, Donna Lucia, with the unwavering dignity of one who had just faced death and salvation, merely shook her head. Her eyes, previously teary, now shone with an almost mystical serenity. "I'm fine, my dear. He protected me." She pointed again to the forest where the lion had vanished. "He is an angel." Meanwhile, the rich man, now identified as Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos, was pushed into the back of one of the patrol cars. Handcuffed, he kept muttering, his words a tangle of terror and delirium. "It's a monster. A white demon. It got me. It turned me in." His bloodshot eyes still reflected the image of the albino lion, not as a savior, but as a herald of his own ruin. Humiliation and panic had broken something within him, transforming the arrogant magnate into a trembling heap of guilt and fear. The fall, the encounter with the beast, the arrival of the police, everything merged into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Sergeant Almeida approached the grave, illuminating it with his flashlight. The freshly removed earth, the depth of the hole, all confirmed the macabre intent. It was an improvised tomb, cold and damp, meant to be Donna Lucia's final resting place. He looked at the wheelchair, which still bore the mark of the lion's head, silent and irrefutable proof of an impossible intervention. "How are we going to write this report?" he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse. Albino lion as key witness and victim savior. The idea was absurd, but the reality before his eyes was even more so. The other officers began to cordon off the area, but their movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if they were caught in a trance. The adrenaline had subsided, giving way to a sense of unreality. They had witnessed something that defied reason, something that would forever change the way they saw the world. The forest, previously just a backdrop for the crime, now seemed to hold deeper secrets, an ancient and untamable magic. Donna Lucia, for her part, seemed the most lucid of all. She asked for a glass of water, and when it was offered, she drank it calmly, observing the officers with a look that seemed to understand their confusion. "Don't worry," she said, her voice soft but laden with ancestral wisdom. "Not everything needs to be explained to be true. Sometimes faith is enough." The phrase resonated in the night air, a reminder that there were forces beyond human comprehension. Sergeant Almeida looked at Donna Lucia, then at the dark forest, and for a brief moment felt a connection to something greater, something that transcended handcuffs and reports. That lion was not just an animal, it was a symbol, a guardian, a herald of wild and pure justice. The story of that night, he knew, would be told and retold, whispered and doubted, but for those who witnessed it, it would be an unquestionable truth, a reminder that the unexpected can emerge from the depths of nature to redefine what is possible. The real battle, however, was just beginning. The battle to make the world believe. The sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and pink. But the light it brought did not dispel the aura of mystery that enveloped the clearing. On the contrary, the morning light seemed to highlight the impossibility of the scene. There were no lion paw prints in the damp earth around the grave, nor any other sign of the beast's presence, except for the mark on the wheelchair and the vivid, terrifying memories in the minds of those present. It was as if the albino lion had been an apparition, a spirit of the forest that came and went, leaving only the trace of its miraculous intervention. The forensic team soon arrived. Its members, accustomed to the cold logic of forensic science, quickly found themselves confronted with the anomaly. They measured, photographed, collected soil and fiber samples, but with each step, the perplexity grew. "There's no evidence of a wild animal here, Sergeant," said one of the experts, his voice laden with skepticism as he examined the area. "No paw prints, no fur, just the disturbed earth and the wheelchair." Almeida merely nodded, speechless. How to explain the inexplicable? Donna Lucia was taken to the police station to give her statement, insisting she didn't need medical attention, just a blanket and a hot tea. Her calm was a stark contrast to the internal chaos of the police officers and Dr. Horacio's delirium. On the way, she looked out the patrol car window, her eyes scanning the dark forest as if searching for a last glimpse of her protector. She knew the world wouldn't believe, but for her, the truth was unshakable. At the police station, Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos was interrogated. His answers were incoherent, a mix of guilt, confession, and accusations against the white demon that had turned him in. He spoke of golden eyes and fur that gleamed under the moon, of a force that pushed him to his fall. The detectives, accustomed to excuses and lies, exchanged confused glances. The story of the albino lion, however absurd it seemed, was the only constant in his fragmented testimony. The rich man's sanity was in question, and the complexity of the case deepened with every word. What seemed like a simple attempted murder transformed into something much larger, something that defied the very understanding of justice and nature. The city still slept, oblivious to the miracle and terror that had unfolded in the darkness of the forest, but soon the world would be forced to confront the impossible. The dawn painting the sky brought no clarity, but accentuated the veil of unreality over the clearing. The pale light of the rising sun, instead of dispelling the shadows, seemed to solidify the mystery. The forensic team, trained to uncover truth through concrete facts, found itself at an impasse. Sergeant Almeida watched them, his own eyes reflecting the same confusion. They scoured every inch, every leaf, every grain of earth, but the evidence of the albino lion was spectral, almost non-existent. There were no clear paw prints in the damp earth, no white fur that could be collected and analyzed. Only the disturbed earth of the grave and the wheelchair, with the unmistakable mark of the beast's head, served as silent witnesses to an event that defied logic. "Sergeant, with all due respect, there's nothing here to suggest the presence of a large animal," said the chief forensic expert, a middle-aged man whose voice was heavy with professional skepticism. He gestured to the area, his eyes searching for a rational explanation. Just the wheelchair, which, well, it's an anomaly, but no paw prints, no fur, no organic traces. It's as if the animal was never here. Almeida felt a knot in his throat. How could he explain that he had witnessed an albino lion push a wheelchair with its head, with the same certainty that he knew his own name? The truth was so fantastic it became unbelievable. The battle to make the world believe, as he had predicted, began there, in that field of earth and silence. Donna Lucia, with her unwavering dignity, was taken to the police station. She refused medical attention, insisting she was perfectly fine, just needed a hot tea and a blanket. Her eyes, however, kept scanning the forest through the patrol car window as if searching for a last glimpse of her protector. For her, the truth was an unshakable rock, immune to the world's skepticism. At the police station, Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos was a spectacle of terror and delirium. Handcuffed to a chair in the interrogation room, he babbled incessantly about the white demon, the golden-eyed monster that had turned him over to the police. His sanity seemed to have unraveled under the weight of panic and humiliation. The detectives, accustomed to elaborate lies and excuses, exchanged confused glances. The story of the albino lion, however absurd it was the only constant in his fragmented testimony. What seemed to be a simple case of attempted murder transformed into an enigma that defied the very understanding of justice and nature. While the city still slept, oblivious to the miracle and terror that had unfolded in the darkness of the forest, Sergeant Almeida sat at his desk, staring at the blank report. The words seemed to refuse to be written. Victim rescued by albino lion. Aggressor brought down by wild animal. The pen's ink felt too heavy. He knew that by writing that, he would be opening a Pandora's box of incredulity and ridicule. The news, however, could not be contained. It leaked, first as an incredulous whisper among officers, then as a wild rumor that spread through the police station corridors, and finally, as a shocking headline that exploded on social media and local news. Albino lion saves elderly woman from grave and aids in arrest of rich assailant. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Skepticism was the first wave. Journalists and TV commentators mocked the story, suggesting that the police officers must have drunk too much or that the elderly woman was senile. Wildlife experts were interviewed, all agreeing that the described behavior was totally impossible for a wild lion. The idea of a predator acting with compassion and intelligence to deliver justice was simply unthinkable, a fantasy. But amidst the chorus of disbelief, there was an undercurrent of fascination. Ordinary people, tired of the world's violence and injustice, wanted to believe. The story of the albino lion touched a deep chord in the human soul, the hope that even in the depths of darkness, kindness and justice could emerge from where least expected. The image of the wheelchair with the mark on its side, released by an officer who couldn't resist photographing it, became the icon of this faith, the silent proof that defied all explanations. Donna Lucia, in her testimony, maintained her calm and dignity. She described the lion with a clarity that contrasted with Dr. Horacio's delirium, but which, paradoxically, seemed even more unbelievable. "He looked into my eyes," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and I felt, he knew, that he understood." She spoke of a connection, an intelligence, a soul behind those golden eyes. The detectives who listened to her felt torn between logic and emotion. They saw her as a victim, but also as a prophetess of a miracle. Sergeant Almeida, pressured by his superiors to revise the report and find a more rational explanation, felt his frustration grow. He had seen it, he had witnessed it, and the truth, however fantastic, was the only one he could report. The battle was not just to make the world believe, but to preserve the integrity of his own experience, of his own vision of what was possible. The forest now was not just a crime scene, but a portal to the inexplicable, a reminder that the universe held secrets that science and reason could not yet decipher. And the truth, like the albino lion, was wild, untamable, and at times inexplicable. The headline exploded like a bomb, not just in the city, but reverberating throughout the country and beyond. Albino lion saves elderly woman from grave and aids in arrest of rich assailant. The phrase, by itself, was an invitation to incredulity, a challenge to logic. Social media boiled, dividing into opposing camps with the ferocity of a pitched battle. On one side, skeptics, armed with the cold blade of reason, ridiculed the story. Renowned journalists, scientists, animal behavior experts, all united in a chorus of mockery. A hoax, collective delusion, the senility of an elderly woman, and the panic of a criminal were the milder explanations. Television programs dedicated hours to debunking what they called the most absurd police fairy tale. On the other side, a growing wave of fascination and hope. Ordinary people, exhausted by the routine of bleak news and the apparent impunity of the powerful, clung to the story of the albino lion like a lighthouse in the darkness. The image of the wheelchair, with the unmistakable mark of the beast's head leaked online, became a symbol. It wasn't just proof. It was an icon that justice, at times, could come from where least expected, from a pure and wild source. This image, replicated millions of times, was the seed of a new faith, a belief in the impossible that challenged reality. Sergeant Almeida felt the weight of this polarization on his shoulders. Each day, the pressure from his superiors increased. "Sergeant, we need a plausible explanation. This is turning into a circus. The police department cannot be associated with fairy tales," Captain Silva bellowed, his face red with frustration. Almeida, however, stood firm. He had seen it. His eyes had witnessed the miracle, and his conscience would not allow him to distort the truth. He refused to rewrite the report, to invent a narrative that denied what he knew to be real. His professional integrity was at stake, but more than that, his own perception of reality had been altered. Almeida's refusal to yield transformed him from a hero into a pariah within his own corporation. Whispers of excessive stress, mental fatigue, and even delusions began to circulate. He was removed from main investigations, relegated to bureaucratic tasks, while a special team was assembled to re-evaluate the case. With the clear intention of finding a rational explanation, however forced, they searched for a paw print, a hair, any trace that could be attributed to a real animal, but the forest guarded its secrets with silent obstinacy. The absence of physical proof of the lion was, paradoxically, the greatest proof of its almost ethereal nature, of its fleeting appearance. Meanwhile, Donna Lucia, with her unwavering serenity, became a central figure. Her testimony, recorded and leaked, was a counterpoint to the spreading hysteria. "He wasn't just any animal," she repeated, her voice calm and firm. "He was a guardian. His eyes held a wisdom that transcends what we know." She spoke of a deep connection, of a soul that had recognized her in her vulnerability. For skeptics, it was proof of senility, of the fragility of the human mind under stress. For believers, it was the voice of truth, confirmation that the world still held wonders. She refused to be a victim, transforming herself unintentionally into a kind of prophetess of the inexplicable. Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos, for his part, was a case apart. His defense, or lack thereof, was a tangle of confessions and accusations against the white demon. His lawyers desperately tried to plead insanity, arguing that the shock of the event had destabilized his mind. But with every incoherent word about golden eyes and a supernatural force that pushed him, he unknowingly reinforced Donna Lucia's story. The rich man, once so self-assured, was undone, a rag of terror and delirium, his wealth and power unable to protect him from the truth he himself had provoked. The story of the albino lion was no longer just a police case. It was a cultural phenomenon, a test of faith and reason for society. Teams of documentarians and mystery hunters invaded the clearing, scouring every inch in search of any evidence. But the forest remained silent, its mystery intact. The rising sun, which previously seemed to solidify the inexplicable, now illuminated a stage where humanity debated its own capacity to believe in what it could not see, touch, or explain. The true battle, the battle for truth, was just beginning, and its echoes would resonate for a long time, challenging everyone to confront the boundary between the possible and the miraculous. The explosion of the news was not a mere local burst. It was a seismic tremor that reverberated across continents. The story of the albino lion, a wild predator acting as a guardian angel, challenged every pillar of science, logic, and human understanding. In a few hours, the small attempted murder case transformed into a global phenomenon, a Rorschach test for the collective psyche. On international news channels, the story was presented with a mix of fascination and disdain. Anchors with serious expressions, accustomed to reporting wars and economic crises, struggled to suppress ironic smiles when mentioning the justice lion. World-renowned biologists and zoologists were called for interviews, all unanimous in their condemnation. Absurd, impossible, a modern fable. They cited the instinctive nature of felines, the absence of empathy, the impossibility of such behavior without years of domestication and training, and even then it would be unprecedented. Science, in its quest for tangible explanations, erected an insurmountable wall against the miracle. But the internet, that cauldron of voices and beliefs, told a different story. Memes of the albino lion with a halo or a superhero cape flooded the networks. Discussion groups buzzed with theories, some conspiratorial, others spiritual. For many, tired of the corruption and violence that seemed to dominate the world, the albino lion was a symbol of hope. Proof that nature, or perhaps something beyond it, still held a purity capable of intervening on behalf of justice. The image of the wheelchair with the unmistakable mark became a global icon, a modern holy shroud for those seeking a sign. Sergeant Almeida, now a ghost in the police station corridors, felt the weight of this dichotomy. Relegated to a dusty room, reviewing old files, he watched the media circus unfold through a small tube television. Every laugh from a commentator, every statement from an expert who had never set foot in the forest was a stab at his integrity. He had seen it, his eyes had witnessed the truth, and the world's refusal to accept it was an almost unbearable burden. The special team, assigned to clean up the mess, returned from the forest day after day empty-handed, which only deepened the mystery and frustration. "No paw prints, no fur, Sergeant. It's as if he was never there," confessed one of the agents, a glimmer of doubt beginning to appear in his own eyes. Donna Lucia, in turn, continued to be the epicenter of an unwavering calm amidst the storm. Her house, now protected by an improvised fence against the horde of journalists and curious onlookers, had become a sanctuary. She gave few interviews, but when she did, her soft yet firm voice echoed with a conviction that disarmed even the most skeptical. "He wasn't an animal, he was a spirit," she said, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she could still see the majestic creature. "He knew right from wrong. He chose me." For believers, she was a witness to a miracle. For skeptics, a traumatized elderly woman whose mind had fabricated a fantasy to cope with the horror. Meanwhile, Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos, in his maximum security cell, was a spectacle of decay. His lawyers, desperate to save him from conviction for attempted murder, intensified the insanity defense. But Horacio didn't help. Instead of feigning, he lived his delusion. "The white demon, it's haunting me. Its golden eyes burn my soul," he screamed, struggling against his restraints, his eyes bloodshot with terror. In each session with forensic psychiatrists, he repeated the same story, with vivid details of the lion pushing the chair, of the panic, of the fall. His accounts, however insane they seemed, were strangely consistent with Donna Lucia's testimony, creating a disturbing dissonance for those trying to uncover the truth. Horacio's legal battle, the search for evidence in the forest, the media polarization, all revolved around an absence, that of the albino lion. It had fulfilled its purpose and disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. The forest, once a stage of terror, was now a sanctuary of silence, guarding its guardian's secret. But its physical absence did not mean its absence of impact. On the contrary, it amplified the mystery, transforming the story into a living legend, a tale that challenged humanity to look beyond the tangible, to question the limits of what was possible. The truth, like a wild lion, refused to be tamed by reason, roaring in every debate, in every article, in every heart that dared to believe. The battle for truth was not just about a crime, but about the very soul of the world, and it was far from over. The battle for truth, which had once been a whisper in the police station corridors, exploded into a global roar, echoing on every screen, in every debate, in every heart. The albino lion, the improbable guardian, had become more than just news. It was a phenomenon, a watershed that forced humanity to confront its own limits of belief. The physical absence of the beast, far from diminishing the mystery, amplified it, transforming it into an omnipresent spectre, a shadow dancing between the light of reason and the darkness of the inexplicable. In centers of power, the story was an embarrassment. Governments and scientific institutions, accustomed to controlling narratives and imposing logic, found themselves powerless before something that defied their entire structure. The pressure on the local police, and on Sergeant Almeida in particular, reached unbearable levels. Captain Silva, now under the spotlight of an internal investigation, demanded a retraction, a sensible explanation that could be presented to the international press. "Sergeant, what you saw, or think you saw, is costing our entire system its credibility. We need a version that doesn't make us look like lunatics," he bellowed, his voice choked with fury and fear. Almeida, however, remained a rock. His removal from main investigations had given him time to reflect, to revisit every detail of that night. He knew what he had seen. The image of the lion, majestic and ethereal, pushing the wheelchair, was etched indelibly in his memory. He refused to lie, to betray his own perception of reality. His integrity, once a pillar of his career, was now his prison. He became a silent martyr, his reputation in tatters, but his conviction unshakable. Meanwhile, the forest, the stage of the miracle, became a point of pilgrimage, not just for journalists and curious onlookers, but for people from all walks of life. Skeptics came to mock, but many others came in search of something. They left flowers, notes, small tokens of faith in the clearing where it all happened. The forest, once feared, was now revered, a place where the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary seemed thinner. The special team, once so confident in its mission to debunk the hoax, now wandered through the woods with a mixture of frustration and a growing, though unadmitted, sense of reverence. The absence of any trace of the lion was no longer just an investigative failure. It was an echo of the mystery, a confirmation that something truly inexplicable had occurred. Donna Lucia, the elderly woman who had been thrown into the grave, transformed into an almost mystical figure. Her house, now a refuge of peace amidst the media chaos, received visits from people seeking her wisdom, her calm. She did not see herself as a prophetess, but her words carried the weight of an ancestral truth. "He came to show me that goodness still exists, even in the wildest places," she said, her eyes serene but deep. "He was not of this world, but his message was for all of us. For the millions who clung to the story like a lifeboat in a sea of cynicism, Donna Lucia was the voice of hope, living proof that the impossible could, in fact, happen." Dr. Horacio Vasconcelos, on the other hand, lived his own hell. In his cell, the terror of the albino lion was a constant reality, more vivid than the concrete walls around him. His lawyers, desperate to build an insanity defense, watched each session with forensic psychiatrists turn into a terrifying monologue about golden eyes that burned the soul and invisible claws that dragged him into the abyss. He was not acting. He was living his delusion, and ironically, every detail of his panic reinforced Donna Lucia's narrative, making his defender's task increasingly impossible. The wealth and power that once protected him were now irrelevant. He stood naked before a truth he himself had invoked. The story of the albino lion was not just a police case nor a media phenomenon. It was a mirror, reflecting society's deepest divisions: faith versus reason, miracle versus science, hope versus cynicism. The world was at a tipping point, forced to question what was real, what was possible. And at the center of it all, the image of the wheelchair with the mark of the beast's head continued to be the silent icon of a truth that refused to be explained, a legend that was only just beginning to be told. The soul of the world was at stake, and the lion, in its absence, continued to roar. The announcement of Horacio Vasconcelos's trial date transformed the polarization into an even greater frenzy. The courthouse, once a stage for legal disputes, would now become the epicenter of a cultural battle. Global media prepared for unprecedented coverage. Television networks set up makeshift studios in front of the courthouse. Legal analysts and animal behavior experts clashed in heated debates, and social media exploded with hashtags ranging from "Just Justice Lion" to "Due Hoax of the Century." For the prosecution, the case was simple: aggravated attempted murder. They planned to present the material evidence: the crime scene, the grave, the damaged wheelchair, Donna Lucia's coherent testimony, and Horacio's initial confession. Before his delirium set in, the albino lion would be treated as a collective hallucination, an irrelevant detail, or an invention of a traumatized mind. But they knew the feline's shadow would hang over the court, a white elephant, or rather, a white lion in the room. Horacio's defense lawyers, led by the astute Dr. Elias Montenegro, faced an almost insoluble dilemma: how to defend a rich and powerful man who, instead of denying the crime, insisted he had been attacked by a ghostly lion. The insanity plea was the only way out, but the consistency of Horacio's delusions with Donna Lucia's account was a double-edged sword. If he was mad, why did his madness mirror the truth of a sane witness? This, paradoxically, lent credibility to the lion's story, albeit in a distorted way. Sergeant Almeida, now officially removed from all investigative duties and relegated to administrative tasks, watched the unfolding events with a mixture of bitterness and a strange sense of validation. He was a man who had seen the impossible, and the world was about to be forced to confront that same impossibility in a court of law. His imminent dismissal no longer frightened him as much as the idea that the truth might be buried under an avalanche of skepticism and convenience. He felt a calling, an urgency to act, even if he didn't know how. Meanwhile, Donna Lucia prepared to testify. Her calm was a beacon amidst the storm. She feared neither the court nor the lawyers nor public scrutiny. She would speak her truth, simple and unshakable. For her, the lion was not a miracle to be proven, but a divine intervention to be witnessed. Her faith, once private, was now a shield against the world's cynicism. In the days leading up to the trial, The forest seemed to breathe with new life. Pilgrims increased, some camping in the clearing, waiting for a sign, a shadow, a roar. Biologists and zoologists, once so categorical, began to divide. Some, more open-minded, suggested the possibility of extreme anomalous behavior, though unprecedented. Others, still firm in their orthodoxy, redoubled efforts to find a rational explanation, however convoluted. The absence of any physical evidence of the lion was, for them, definitive proof that it had never existed. But for believers, it was proof of its ethereal nature, of its escape to a realm beyond human comprehension. The stage was set. The world held its breath, divided between the cold logic of the law and the intoxicating warmth of a miracle. Horacio Vasconcelos's trial would not just be about a man and his crime, but about the very nature of reality, about what humanity was willing to accept as truth. And at the center of it all, invisible yet omnipresent, the albino lion awaited, its silent roar echoing in the hearts and minds of everyone. The day of the trial dawned under a gray sky, as if the very firmament sensed the gravity of the events that would unfold. The streets around the courthouse were impassable, taken over by a crowd that stretched for blocks. Journalists from every corner of the globe jostled, microphones pointed, cameras at the ready, prepared to capture every nuance of what promised to be the trial of the century. It wasn't just a legal case, it was a spectacle, a referendum on faith and reason, broadcast live to billions of people, a watershed in humanity's perception of reality. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electrifying, dense with anticipation. Every seat was occupied, and the galleries overflowed with curious onlookers, skeptics, and believers, all there to witness the collision of worlds. The judge, a man of grave demeanor and impeccable reputation, struggled to maintain order amidst the buzz. He knew this would not be an ordinary trial, that the usual rules of law would be tested by a narrative that defied logic itself. Horacio Vasconcelos was brought into the room, handcuffed, but with an aura of despair that made him almost unrecognizable. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now carried a profound terror, a fear that seemed to come from a place much darker than the prospect of imprisonment. He looked around, not at the curious faces, but at invisible shadows, murmuring to himself about the presence of golden eyes and sharp claws that haunted him. The defense, led by the astute Dr. Montenegro, watched him with a mixture of pity and frustration. Insanity was the only card, but with each of Horacio's murmurs, the line between madness and truth became thinner, more dangerous. The prosecution began with Dr. Sofia Mendes, a woman of firm voice and impeccable logic, presenting the case. She described the brutality of the crime, Donna Lucia's vulnerability, the defendant's coldness. Material evidence was displayed with surgical precision. Photos of the grave, the damaged wheelchair, the crime scene. Horacio's initial testimony before his mental deterioration was read. A clear confession of his intention to get rid of the elderly woman. The albino lion, an invention, a post-traumatic delusion, a desperate attempt to escape responsibility. This court is not a stage for fairy tales, but for the application of the law, she declared, her voice resonating with authority and a tone of disdain. What we have here is an act of human cruelty, not divine intervention. But the lion's shadow was undeniable. With each mention of the grave, the forest, the wheelchair, the public seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the inevitable. The prosecution tried to sweep the feline under the rug, but it was too large, too majestic to be ignored. The very absence of its physical image in court paradoxically made it more present, an invisible force that hung over everyone. Sergeant Almeida sat in the back rows, a silent observer, but with his heart ablaze. His uniform, once a symbol of his authority, now seemed a disguise for his powerlessness. He listened to the prosecutor's words, the vehement denial of what he knew to be true, and felt a knot in his throat. His reputation was in ruins, his career hanging by a thread, but his conviction remained intact. He had seen it. He knew. And with every word that tried to discredit the lion, the urgency within him grew, an irrepressible call to defend the truth he had witnessed. He had to do something, but what? How could an ordinary man, stripped of power and credibility, fight against the machinery of justice and the world's incredulity? The defense, in turn, presented its thesis. Dr. Montenegro, with engaging oratory, argued that Horacio Vasconcelos, though he had committed a terrible act, was not in his right mind at the time of the crime. He painted a picture of a man under immense stress, who succumbed to a psychotic break and who now lived in a state of constant delusion. The albino lion, he said with a dramatic pause, is the clearest manifestation of his disturbed mind, a symbol of his complete disconnection from reality. He tried to use the lion's story as proof of insanity, but the irony was palpable. By describing Horacio's delusions, he, unintentionally, provided details that coincided with Donna Lucia's account, feeding the narrative of the miracle and doubt in the jurors' minds. The tension increased with each passing hour. Forensic psychiatrists, called to testify, presented contradictory reports. Some attested to Horacio's insanity, others suggested malingering or a personality disorder that did not exempt him from guilt. But even the most skeptical among them found it difficult to explain the consistency of Horacio's delusions with the facts of the case, the way his madness seemed to mirror a truth they refused to accept. Meanwhile, Donna Lucia's figure loomed over the court, even before her appearance. Her calm, her wisdom, her unshakable faith were topics of discussion in the corridors, on social media, on television programs. She was Horacio's antithesis, the personification of resilience and belief. Her arrival at the courthouse, escorted by a small team, was an event in itself. The crowd parted for her, some reaching out, others offering flowers. She seemed oblivious to the frenzy, her eyes serene, her presence radiating a peace that contrasted violently with the surrounding chaos. She was no ordinary witness. She was an almost sacred figure whose voice the world awaited. The judge announced the lunch break and the room erupted in murmurs. The first day of the trial had established the battlefield, reason against faith, law against miracle. And at the center of it all, the absent yet immensely powerful figure of the albino lion, whose silent roar continued to echo in everyone's hearts and minds. Almeida, rising, felt a weight in his chest, but also a growing determination. He couldn't stand by. The truth needed to be heard, not as madness, but as what it truly was, a miracle. He knew that Horacio's trial was not just about justice, but about the soul of the world, and he was ready to fight for it, whatever the cost. The lunch break was a whirlwind of speculation and anxiety. In the courthouse corridors, Donna Lucia's name was whispered with reverence and curiosity. She was the central figure, the voice that could untie the knot of incredulity or tighten it further. Sergeant Almeida, however, did not seek the murmurs of the crowd. His mind was ablaze, a fire fueled by injustice and silenced truth. He felt the weight of his powerlessness, but also the strength of an unshakable conviction. He could not allow the lion's story to be buried as a delusion. He could not allow Donna Lucia's faith to be ridiculed. He had to act, even without a plan, even without authority. The truth, he knew, was more important than his career, more important than his own freedom. When the courthouse doors opened again, a wave of anticipation swept through the hall. Cameras buzzed again, journalists positioned themselves, and the crowd settled, each person holding their breath. The atmosphere was palpable, charged with a tension that could be cut with a knife. Everyone waited for her. Donna Lucia was led to the witness stand. Her movements were slow, but her posture was erect, dignified. Her serene, deep eyes swept the courtroom without hesitation, without fear. She was not a victim, but a survivor, a witness to something that defied human comprehension. Her presence radiated a calm that contrasted violently with the frenzy around her, silencing even the most skeptical. Dr. Sofia Mendez, the prosecutor, began the interrogation with a voice that sought the firmness of logic, but which seemed to falter before the elderly woman's serenity. She started with questions about Donna Lucia's health, her memory, her capacity for discernment. The answers were short, clear, unshakable. "Donna Lucia," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what happened that day at the moment the defendant, Horacio Vasconcelos, took you to the clearing?" Donna Lucia's voice was soft, but it resonated throughout the courtroom, laden with a disarming clarity. "He pushed me into the grave. I fell. The wheelchair fell with me." There was no rancor in her voice, only the statement of a brutal fact. The prosecutor continued, detailing the fall, the darkness, the despair. But then the inevitable question came, the one everyone was waiting for. "And the lion, Donna Lucia? You claim an albino lion saved you? Can you describe this apparition?" A sepulchral silence fell over the courtroom. Donna Lucia closed her eyes for an instant, as if reliving the moment, not with terror, but with profound reverence. "He came, large and white as snow. His eyes were golden, filled with a light not of this world. He saw me. He saw Horacio. And then, with his head, he pushed the chair out of the grave. He saved me." The prosecutor tried to discredit the account. "Donna Lucia, you were in shock, in an extremely dangerous situation. Isn't it possible that you imagined this, or that your faith, understandable in such a desperate moment, created this image?" "I didn't imagine it," Donna Lucia replied, her voice without a trace of doubt. "I saw it, with these eyes. He was real, more real than anything I've ever seen." She didn't argue. She simply bore witness. For her, the truth needed no proof, only to be spoken. When the defense took over the interrogation, Dr. Montenegro tried to use Donna Lucia's account to reinforce Horacio's insanity plea. "Donna Lucia, the defendant also describes an albino lion with golden eyes. Mr. Vasconcelos is in a state of delusion. Don't you think that perhaps the trauma led you to share this same delusion, to create a narrative to make sense of the inexplicable?" Donna Lucia looked directly at Horacio, who was cowering in his chair, his eyes wide, as if the lion were there, in the middle of the courtroom. "It's not delusion, doctor, it's the truth. Horacio saw what I saw. He refused to believe, but he saw. His fear is not of prison, it's of what he saw, what he did, what the lion represents." Donna Lucia's words struck Horacio like lightning. He began to tremble uncontrollably, muttering about golden eyes and waiting claws. His panic was genuine, visceral, and the audience could feel it. The line between madness and truth, which Dr. Montenegro tried to draw, disintegrated with every word from the elderly woman. The consistency of Horacio's delusions with Donna Lucia's vision was more disturbing than any contradiction. The courtroom was in a silent uproar. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of confusion and strange fascination. The cold logic of the law was in question, confronted by the unshakable simplicity of a faith that transcended reason. It was in this moment of suspension, when Donna Lucia's silence echoed louder than any words, that Sergeant Almeida felt an irrepressible impulse. He could no longer be a passive observer. The truth, his truth, needed to be heard. He rose abruptly from his seat in the back rows, his voice, though choked with emotion, cutting through the air like thunder. "I saw it too!" Almeida shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom walls. "I saw the tracks, I saw the chair, I saw the fear in his eyes. I believe, Donna Lucia, the lion exists." Pandemonium erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Security guards moved quickly towards Almeida, but the seed of doubt, of possibility, had already been planted. The truth, which he so feared would be buried, now exploded at the heart of the system, challenging everyone to confront the impossible. The trial was no longer just about Horacio Vasconcelos, it was about the very nature of reality, and Almeida, the dismissed sergeant, had just forced the world to choose a side. Almeida's shout tore through the veil of formality, exploding into the tense courtroom silence like lightning in a blue sky. The judge's gavel pounded furiously, but its sound was muffled by the pandemonium that ensued. Murmurs turned into exclamations, chairs scraped, and the mass of journalists and curious onlookers stirred, trying to capture every fragment of that surreal scene. The security guards, in their immaculate uniforms, advanced on Almeida, but he would not be silenced. His voice, hoarse and desperate, continued to echo, a primal cry of truth. They were there, the tracks, the wheelchair marks, the fear in his eyes when he saw me. He knew that I knew. The lion is real. He struggled against the strong arms that held him, his eyes fixed on the jurors, then on Donna Lucia, seeking a validation she already offered him in her serene gaze. The prosecutor, Dr. Sofia Mendes, was in shock, her face pale. Dr. Montenegro, for the defense, seemed to have been punched in the stomach, his insanity plea now dangerously swaying. How to explain that a delusional man and a traumatized witness shared a vision, and now a third, a police sergeant, corroborated the existence of physical evidence of this same madness? Horacio Vasconcelos, in turn, was in a state of complete collapse. Almeida's words, combined with Donna Lucia's unshakable conviction, had pushed him to the abyss. He cowered in the defendant's chair, his hands covering his ears, his eyes wide with terror. The golden eyes! He's here! He saw me! The claws! The claws! His screams were a lament of panic, an involuntary confession that transcended reason and law. It wasn't the fear of prison that consumed him, but the dread of that creature that defied logic, that had witnessed his crime and that, to him, seemed to pursue him beyond the limits of sanity. The judge, a man of austere demeanor and thunderous voice, finally managed to impose some order, though the tension in the air was palpable, almost electric. "Sergeant Almeida, you are in contempt of court. You will be removed immediately. And if you attempt to interfere again, you will be arrested." His voice was firm, but even he could not ignore the impact of that moment. The seed of doubt, planted by Donna Lucia and watered by Horacio's despair, now blossomed with Almeida's vehemence. As he was dragged out, Almeida didn't stop speaking, his voice becoming more distant, but his words still penetrating the collective consciousness. "Look at the tracks. Check the scene. He exists. The lion exists." The door closed with a dull thud, silencing Almeida, but not the echo of his words. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom, a silence different from before, laden not with anticipation, but with perplexity and a new kind of fear. The jurors, previously skeptical, now exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and a strange apprehension. The cold logic of the law had been shaken by an intervention that seemed straight out of a fairy tale or a nightmare. Donna Lucia, seated in the witness chair, observed everything with a calm that seemed supernatural. Her eyes met Horacio's for a brief instant, and in him she saw not only fear, but the confirmation of her own truth. For her, Almeida's intervention was not chaos, but a validation, a sign that the truth, however extraordinary, would find its way. Dr. Sofia Mendes, the prosecutor, regained her composure with visible effort. She knew the defense's strategy had been seriously compromised. Horacio's insanity, which previously seemed a plausible escape route, now dangerously intertwined with the narrative of the miracle. If Horacio was delusional, why were his delusions so consistent with Donna Lucia's account, and now with the police sergeant's observations? Dr. Montenegro, on the other hand, was at a crossroads. He needed to re-evaluate his strategy. The line separating madness from truth had become too thin. Horacio's panic, which should have reinforced his insanity plea, now seemed more like a reaction of guilt and terror in the face of something real. The judge, after a few moments of reflection, banged his gavel again, his voice more subdued, but with unquestionable authority. The court will take a 15-minute recess for everyone to compose themselves. When we return, we will proceed with the witnesses' interrogation. But the truth was that no one would compose themselves so easily. The trial had taken an unexpected turn, a plunge into the realm of the inexplicable. Reason and faith were in a direct clash, and the figure of the albino lion, previously a mere bizarre detail, now loomed over the courtroom like a majestic and enigmatic shadow. With each passing moment, the line between what was possible and what was a miracle became more indistinct, and the world, through that court, was forced to confront a reality that defied its entire understanding. Sergeant Almeida, even banished, had lit a fire that no one could extinguish. Horacio Vasconcelos' trial was no longer just about a crime, but about the very nature of truth. The judge's gavel had silenced the pandemonium, but not the storm brewing in everyone's hearts and minds. The 15-minute recess, announced as a break for composure, was, in fact, a forced dive into the abyss of uncertainty. The courtroom emptied in a feverish buzz, with journalists rushing to their phones, lawyers whispering in corners, and the jurors, previously impassive, now visibly disturbed, being escorted to their deliberation room. For the prosecutor, Dr. Sofia Mendes, the world had turned upside down. Her strategy, once so clear, now seemed as fragile as glass. Horacio Vasconcelos, the defendant, had been painted as a cruel and calculating man, or at best for the defense, a delusional madman. But now, the delusion had a witness. And that witness, Donna Lucia, was the victim herself, a figure of unwavering dignity. And to complicate matters further, a police sergeant, even if dismissed, had corroborated the existence of tracks, of physical evidence, of something that defied all logic. In her office, Sofia paced back and forth, hands on her head. What to do with an albino lion that now had 3 witnesses, 2 of them with strangely consistent accounts? Horacio's insanity plea, which Dr. Montenegro desperately tried to push, now turned against him. If Horacio was delusional, why was his delusion identical to Donna Lucia's vision? And why was a supposedly sane police officer talking about tracks? Consistency was not proof of madness, but of a shared truth, however incredible. Sofia realized she needed to shift focus. It was no longer about discrediting the lion, but about using Horacio's terror as proof of his guilt. On the other side of the legal spectrum, Dr. Montenegro felt the ground slip from beneath his feet. Horacio, his client, was now a human wreck, and his defense a spiderweb about to break. Horacio's panic, which should have reinforced the idea of his fractured mind, now seemed more like a reaction of guilt and terror in the face of something real, something he had witnessed and that haunted him. Montenegro tried to approach Horacio, who was cowering in his chair, still muttering about golden eyes and claws. Horacio, you need to compose yourself. This is exactly what they want, for you to seem crazy. But Horacio didn't listen. His eyes were fixed on an invisible point, as if the lion were there, ready to pounce. The lawyer knew he could no longer argue that the lion was an invention of a sick mind, for Donna Lucia and Almeida had lent credibility to this invention. The only way out was to try to disqualify Almeida as an unbalanced police officer and Donna Lucia as a traumatized and suggestible victim. But the elderly woman's serenity made that task almost impossible. In the deliberation rooms, the jurors exchanged apprehensive glances. The logic that guided them was collapsing. They were ordinary men and women, accustomed to facts, evidence, and rational testimonies. But their reason was in question: how to judge a crime where the main witness was an albino lion. The image of Donna Lucia, with her unshakable faith, and Horacio's visceral despair, coupled with Almeida's primal cry, had planted a seed of doubt that transcended the legal. They didn't know what to think, but they felt that something extraordinary had happened. When the judge returned to his seat, the silence that fell over the courtroom was different from before. It was not just respect for authority, but a tense, almost religious anticipation. With each passing moment, the line between what was possible and what was a miracle became more indistinct. The figure of the albino lion, previously a mere bizarre detail, now loomed over the courtroom like a majestic and enigmatic shadow, an invisible but omnipresent character. Donna Lucia was led back to the witness stand. Her calm was a stark counterpoint to the agitation surrounding her. She did not seem tired or shaken. Her eyes, previously filled with resigned sadness, now shone with a light that seemed to reflect the golden eyes she had described. Dr. Sofia Mendes stood up, her voice now firmer, with a new conviction. She had re-evaluated her strategy. "Donna Lucia," she began, her voice echoing in the silence, "do you maintain your account of the albino lion, even after the commotion we witnessed?" "Yes," Donna Lucia replied without hesitation. "My truth does not change with the world's noise." "And the defendant, Horacio Vasconcelos," Sofia continued, pointing to Horacio, who was still trembling in his chair. "He also saw the lion, according to you. And he reacted with terror, didn't he?" "With a consuming terror," Donna Lucia confirmed. "A terror that wasn't of death, but of what he had done and what the lion represented to him." The prosecutor turned to the jurors, her voice gaining strength. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense tries to convince us that the defendant is insane, that his panic is a delusion. But I ask you, if it is a delusion, why is it so consistent with the victim's account? Why is Horacio's terror not of just any imaginary creature, but exactly of the one that confronted him at the moment of his crime? Horacio's fear is not madness, but the overwhelming weight of his own guilt projected onto the image of the justice-seeking lion that witnessed his cowardly act. He saw the lion, yes, and the lion saw him. And that gaze, that silent and wild witness, is what haunts him, what breaks him. It is not prison that terrifies him. It is the consciousness of his sin, embodied in those golden eyes. The prosecutor's words struck Horacio like a whip. He let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure terror, and collapsed in his chair, eyes rolled back, mouth open in a silent lament. The courtroom was in shock. The line between insanity and guilt, once so clear, had completely disintegrated. The albino lion, previously a figure of mystery, now became the mirror of Horacio's soul, reflecting not his madness, but the depth of his crime and the weight of his conscience. The trial was no longer just about a man and a woman, but about the truth that revealed itself in unexpected ways, challenging reason and the very nature of justice. Horacio's strangled cry echoed through the courtroom, a primal sound that tore through the veil of civility. It was not a cry of physical pain, but of a terror that came from a much deeper place, a place where reason unraveled and guilt materialized. His eyes rolled back, his mouth open in a silent lament, his body convulsing in the chair, all confirmed the image of a broken man, not by madness, but by the unbearable weight of a truth he desperately tried to bury. The pandemonium that followed was instantaneous. The judge, with a grave expression, banged his gavel forcefully, but the sound was almost muffled by the confusion. Bailiffs rushed to Horacio, trying to restrain him, while Dr. Montenegro, pale and desperate, pleaded for a medical team. The prosecutor, Dr. Sofia Mendes, remained standing, her posture erect, her eyes fixed on the defendant, a mixture of triumph and a strange melancholy in her gaze. She had hit a raw nerve, and Horacio's reaction was the most compelling proof that her thesis, however extraordinary, was correct. The lion was not a hallucination. It was Horacio's conscience, personified in a majestic and relentless figure. Donna Lucia, seated in the witness chair, observed the scene with an almost disturbing serenity. For her, Horacio's collapse was not a surprise, but the inevitable manifestation of a justice that transcends the laws of men. Her eyes, which had witnessed cowardice and miracle, now saw the truth unfold in a brutal and undeniable way. Horacio's fear was not the fear of a madman, but the dread of a guilty man confronted with his own reflection. The judge, after a few minutes of controlled chaos, managed to restore order. The emergency medical team, already present in the courtroom as a precaution due to the high-profile nature of the case, quickly attended to Horacio. He was removed from the room on a stretcher, still muttering incoherently, his eyes fixed on an invisible point, as if the albino lion were there, in every shadow, in every gaze. Dr. Montenegro, his voice choked, requested a mistrial, citing his client's mental incapacity. Your Honor, it is evident that the defendant is not in a condition to proceed. His sanity is compromised, and insisting on this trial would be an affront to justice and human rights. Dr. Sofia Mendes, however, counter-argued with calculated calm. Your Honor, what we witnessed is not a sign of insanity, but the visceral manifestation of guilt. The defendant, confronted with the truth of his actions and the silent witness who observed them, could not bear the weight of his own conscience. His panic is not a delusion, but the reaction of a man who knows what he did and who was seen. To request a mistrial now would be to allow him to escape responsibility, using supposed madness as a shield for his cowardice. I suggest that the trial proceed and that the defendant's condition be evaluated by an independent medical board, but that his reactions be considered as part of the evidence of his guilt. The court was at an impasse. The line between insanity and guilt, previously a clear barrier, had completely disintegrated. The jurors, once skeptical, now exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of shock, perplexity, and a growing conviction. The image of Horacio, which might previously have evoked pity, now seemed that of a man tormented by his own demons, and the albino lion, once a bizarre figure, became the catalyst for this torment. The judge, his brow furrowed in deep reflection, banged his gavel again. In light of the events, the court will take a longer recess. The defendant will undergo an immediate psychiatric evaluation. The result of this evaluation will determine the next steps. However, I want to make it clear that the court will consider all evidence, including the defendant's behavior, in light of what has been presented. This trial is not just about the law, but about the truth, however unexpected it may reveal itself. The recess extended, but brought no calm. On the contrary, the suspension of the trial only intensified the fever that gripped the city and the country. The media buzzed, divided between skepticism and fascination. The Lion of Justice, the miracle of the grave, Horacio's madness were the headlines screaming from newspapers and screens. In the streets, people discussed, debated, and the story of Donna Lucia and her wild protector infiltrated the popular imagination, defying logic and reason. The court, once a bastion of law, had transformed into a stage where the inexplicable danced with the tangible, and no one could look away. Horacio Vasconcelos underwent a battery of psychiatric examinations. The specialists, renowned in their fields, found a man in a state of nervous collapse with symptoms of paranoia and extreme terror. He continued to murmur about golden eyes and claws, about a presence that watched him, that judged him. However, and to Montenegro's despair, the reports concluded that, although Horacio was in a fragile and disturbed mental state, he did not present a condition of insanity that would prevent him from discerning the nature of his actions or understanding the judicial process. His condition was described as an acute reactive psychosis, triggered by the trauma of the event and the weight of guilt, manifesting as a projection of his own terror. In other words, he was not insane in the legal sense of not knowing what he was doing. He was broken by what he knew he had done. The lion was not an invention of a sick mind, but the materialization of his own dread, the personification of his tormented conscience. When the judge, with an impassive face, announced the resumption of the trial, a wave of anticipation swept through the courtroom. The decision to proceed, despite Horacio's state, was a fatal blow to the defense. Prosecutor Sofia Mendez, with a glint in her eyes, knew that the truth, however strange, had found its way. The closing arguments began. Dr. Montenegro, visibly exhausted, made one last, desperate appeal. His voice, once so confident, now trembled. He tried to disqualify the reports, arguing that reactive psychosis was, in practice, a form of insanity. He implored the jurors to cling to reason, to ignore folklore and superstitions, not to allow a fantastic story to obscure justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pointing to Horacio, who was back in his chair, sedated but still trembling uncontrollably. "Look at this man. He is a victim of his own sick mind, of a trauma that brought him to the brink of the abyss. We cannot condemn him for a hallucination, for a delusion. Justice must be blind, yes, but not to reality." Then it was Dr. Sofia Mendez's turn. She stood up, her posture imposing, her voice calm but laden with unshakable conviction. She didn't need to shout. The truth she defended echoed on its own. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice filling the tense silence, "the defense asks you to ignore what you saw, what you felt. It asks you to ignore the defendant's visceral terror, to ignore Donna Lucia's unshakable serenity, to ignore Officer Almeida's testimony. They ask you to ignore the truth because it doesn't fit into their cardboard boxes of rationality." She paused, her eyes sweeping over each juror's face. "Horacio Vasconcelos is not mad, ladies and gentlemen. He is guilty, and his guilt broke him. The albino lion is not a hallucination. It is the silent witness to his crime, the mirror of his cowardice, the herald of a justice that transcends what we can comprehend. Horacio's terror is not of an imaginary creature. It is the terror of being seen, of being judged, not just by us, but by something much greater, something primal." Sofia turned to Donna Lucia, who observed everything with a faint smile on her lips. Donna Lucia did not ask for a miracle, she simply lived one. And her testimony, simple and pure, is the rock upon which the truth was built. The lion not only saved her, it brought to light the darkness in Horacio's heart, and the unshakable strength of faith and life. Justice, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is not just a set of laws. It is the pursuit of truth. And the truth in this case manifested itself in a way that challenges us, that forces us to look beyond the obvious, to recognize that there are mysteries in the world that reason alone cannot explain. The albino lion is not legal proof in the traditional sense, but it is irrefutable proof that Horacio Vasconcelos committed a heinous act. and that nature itself refused to allow him to go unpunished. Horacio's terror is his confession, his brokenness is his sentence. Sophia's words hung in the air, heavy with the force of a conviction that had become unshakable. The jurors retired for deliberation. The silence that followed was charged with an almost palpable tension. Hours dragged on. The world waited. Lie. The door to the deliberation room opened. The jurors returned, their faces serious, but with a new light in their eyes. The judge asked for the verdict. The jury foreman stood up, his voice firm, but with a tone of gravity that echoed the magnitude of the moment. We, the jury, declare the defendant, Horacio Vasconcelos, guilty of aggravated attempted murder and concealment of a body. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Montenegro collapsed in his chair. Horacio, despite sedation, let out a moan, his eyes rolling back again, as if he saw the lion there, in every corner of the room, ready to pounce. The sentence was handed down days later. Horacio Vasconcelos was condemned to the maximum penalty, without possibility of bail or parole for many years. He was taken to a maximum security prison where his torment would continue. They say that even behind bars, he still murmured about the golden eyes and the claws, living in a private hell, haunted by the image of the albino lion that witnessed his crime and became the judge of his soul. Donna Lucia, in turn, found peace. Her faith was not only validated, but strengthened. She became a symbol of resilience and of a hope that defied darkness. Her story, the story of the albino lion, spread throughout the world, a tale that blended the real and the mystical, reminding everyone that justice can, at times, come from where least expected, and that nature, in its wild wisdom, has its own ways of balancing the scales. Almeida and Sofia Mendez, though they had faced ridicule and skepticism, emerged from that trial with the certainty that they had defended not only the law, but a greater truth. Their careers were forever marked by the albino lion case, a precedent that challenged the very structure of jurisprudence, forcing the world to consider the possibility that justice, in its purest form, can manifest in ways that transcend human understanding. The albino lion was never seen again, but its legend remained, a whisper on the winds, a majestic and enigmatic shadow that hung over the collective memory. It was a reminder that, even in the deepest abysses of human wickedness, hope can emerge, and that nature in its grandeur can be the most relentless and just of witnesses. And so, the world learned that sometimes the deepest truth lies not in the words of men, but in the silent roar of a lion, and in the miracle of a wheelchair that rolled out of the grave, carrying with it not just a life, but the very essence of justice.